Scratch files, and I'm back now in main activity. If you can go ahead and do the same, and I don't need the project pane, so I'm going to close this now. So back in our project, we can now apply our learning of the when expression. Just before we do that, just a quick word on this line that we have to our on navigation selected listener. Back when I recorded the bottom navigation view tutorial, using the navigation item selected listener was the correct way to do it for switching the items. Android Studio has now marked this as deprecated, and I'll do a tutorial in the next video explaining what deprecated means, what you can do if you ever see this again. It's not immediately a problem, okay, so we won't change it in this tutorial, and I will eventually re-record that tutorial. So some students in the future, you may see this point I'm making about deprecated. You may have some different code to me here, as I would have already gone and fixed this. But it's still worth pointing out, as Android changes all the time. Okay, so deprecated is not immediately a problem. We'll cover it properly in the next tutorial. Okay, so moving down into our on navigation item selected method, you can see we have an if, else block. Quite verbose, quite a lot of code there to do something simple. Now, it would be a very good challenge for you now to re-implement that yourselves from scratch. However, you could cheat and click on the warning and have Android. Now, an if problem, we'll cover it properly in the next tutorial. Okay, so moving down into our on navigation item selected method, you can see we have an if, else block. Quite verbose, quite a lot of code there to do something simple. Now, it would be a very good challenge for you now to re-implement that basis if else that I'm expecting. And I'm going to do my when ID is r.add, and anything else, we will do this code block. And when it is now cycling, we run the on cycle returning true. That's just one line. Okay, so that's the solution I have. We still have a warning to do with lifting return out of the assignment. We'll come to that in a second. But if I just undo everything that I've just done with Control Z, Command Z, get back to our if statement. So if you compare what I had there with what Android Studio changes it to, so Alt Enter, Option Enter, replace if with when, you can see it pretty much does the same thing, apart from my inline return false on the else block. Okay, so if you did do that yourself and you've got that solution, and you're already using the when statement correctly, that's fantastic. So before we go with their suggestion, and we will take that suggestion on board in a moment, we will apply it. You can see that we are returning on every option. We're returning true, or returning false. Okay, so what they're saying here, if I hover over it, is the return should be lifted out of the when. If you think back to our previous tutorial on the when expression, you can return the value of a when expression directly. Okay, so if I do Alt Enter, Option Enter, and apply their suggestion, lift return out of when, we now have return when, and then they remove the word return from each line, because the way a when expression works, the way an if else expression works is, it will return whatever the value is at the end of the code block. So we return, and then the when block runs, and it will return whatever is the final value, the final statement. Okay, so true, false. And of course we can do our normal tricks with this. We can do Alt Enter and convert it to an expression body, so that will remove the return word altogether, and the curly brackets and just do equals. So this is a function expression, so let's do that, convert to expression body. So we now have a function expression, and I can see it's returning true and false, so I can remove the word boolean, I can remove the type, and let Kotlin infer that. So that's nice and clean. There's just one further trick that we could do. We don't have to do it, but I would probably do this myself if I was working on this, personally or at work. I would love to be able to do all three of these options in line on one line. So I'm running a method on cycling clicked, and then just saying true. Well, if I convert these methods on cycling clicked and on running clicked to actually return true or false, then I don't need the word true. So I'm going to do exactly this. So on cycling clicked, I'm going to, after the fragment committing code, but before the end of the method, I'm going to type the word return true, which will return an error saying that it's not expecting us to return anything. Okay, but if I then Alt Enter, Option Enter on this, I can change the return type of this method to boolean. Do you see that? It adds the type. So now I can remove the word true, because this method returns true. This resolves to true. It's the same thing. Okay, I'll do the same thing with the running clicked method. This time I'll do it properly. So colon boolean, and then we get an error, and then at the end of the function block, return true. And again, I don't need the word true because on running click returns true. So now I can remove the curly brackets, do this inline, and auto format, and you can see we now have a very, very clean and tidy use of the when expression. Fantastic. It's time now to look at this term deprecated. In the previous tutorial, we saw how some code that I had written definition was a code method. So before we annotation written a set, we can see our interface. And for that I'm saying Java, Oracle, I quite like that, or better code, rather than just me. So the question is, meaning the question answer is happy with it working on item selected listener, on item selected, not on navigation item. Okay, a more generic method, a more generic interface. So using set on item selected listener, not on navigation item, just the plain method or the any point in the future item. And then we provide the believe it or not, thinking all the way back to inheritance and polymorphism. But to be completely accurate and to remove all the deprecation, we will change the listener for the generic on item selected listener. So delete all of this and just type on item selected listener, and it's the one from the navigation bar view. And hey presto, we fixed the problem, and we've learned about the concept of deprecation on the way. Let's move on. It's time now to look at this term deprecated. And just type on item selected listener, and it's the one from the navigation I've closed down all my Scratch files and I'm back now in main activity. And I'm running and auto We've gone pretty much as far as we can go now before actually needing to save the data and store it, so the same records are there every time you open the app. And as this is our first go at saving any sort of data in our apps, I'm going to dedicate a whole separate section to that to give it the attention it deserves. However, there is one final topic we haven't covered yet, and that was on making an options menu in the toolbar. We've already introduced the concept of menu files in Android before. If you look on the left in the project pane, in the menu folder, we have one for our button nav. If I double click into it and go to the code, we have a couple of items, menu items, and these are used to power our button navigation view. If I just command click on binding the button nav to jump into our layout file, specifically on the button nav item, so control click, command click, activity main, you can see we use the menu in the layout code there, and then that's what powers the items on our button navigation view. If I just zoom a bit, you can see there running and cycling. Okay, just gonna close this down for now. Well, menu resource files like this can actually be used in multiple places for multiple things in Android, and one possibility is using them to make a toolbar options menu. If I just load up the emulator now, so you can see here the emulator, many apps use this concept of an options menu, like an overflow menu, and you'll see this as a three-dot icon, usually in the top right of the screen, or sometimes it's used on individual items. To show you what I mean, I'll open up Google Pixel's messaging app, and you can see in the top right we have three dots there. This is in the toolbar, and there's an options menu, and if I click this, it loads a drop-down with some more options. So thinking now about our record-keeping app, it might be a nice idea to give the user the ability to clear the records all in one go, to clear the running records, to clear the cycling records, or if you want to completely restart, maybe for a new year, the option to reset all records. So we can use this options menu in our app and have this three-dot symbol in the top right of our app in the toolbar, and when they click it, it will give the user the ability to clear whatever records they want. So doing this is quite simple. Let's jump back to the app and go back to main activity. The first thing we're going to need to do is to define the menu items, very similar to our button nav. So in the project pane, right-click on menu and do new menu resource file. And just so you know, it's a menu resource file because we're right-clicking on the menu folder. Okay, and let's just and do new menu resource file. The menu items, very similar to our bottom nav. So in the project pane, right-click on menu and do new menu resource file. And just so you know, it's a menu resource file because we're right-clicking on the menu folder. Okay, and let's just call this toolbar. We know it's a menu because it's in the menu folder. So I know this is the toolbar menu. Okay, you can see that in the project pane, and we have an empty menu. I could refer to my bottom nav for this, so I can copy one of these items, but I think I'll just do it from scratch. Left arrow, item. And the first thing I'm going to do is give it an ID, because when they tap one of these options, we want to know which one they've tapped and be able to run the code for that item. So we'll do ID. So we'll have one for resetting running, so reset_running can be the ID. And then the title, remember for many items it's the word title for what the user sees. We will say reset running records. We'll do a self-closing tag, and we'll go ahead straight away and extract the string. Reset running records, that is fine. Unlike the bottom nav, I'm not going to do an icon. Looking at the emulator, looking at the messages toolbar menu, they don't have any icons. I think it'll be absolutely fine as just text only. Okay, so no need for an icon. That'll be absolutely fine. I'm going to copy this 2 more times. 1, 2, and then do one for reset cycling. And I will make a new string, reset cycling records, and then one for resetting all of the records, reset all. and then this can be reset all records, and I'll just quickly go ahead and extract the strings. So Option Enter, extract string resource, and I'll take their suggested resource name, and that's fine. So we have our toolbar menu ready to use. So back to main activity. So the good news is, in activities, creating an options menu like the one you just saw in that messages app is incredibly simple. There was a method that comes as part of the app compat activity class that we inherit from, just like onCreate, but it's for options menus, and it's called onCreate options menu. And this is one of the activity lifecycle methods. What I mean by that is part of the code that runs whenever an activity is created. And we're going to be covering very soon in a mini section entirely on the Android activity lifecycle, what this concept of lifecycle really means in detail. But for now, all we need to know is there's a method called, if you can make a few line breaks after onCreate and start typing, on C create O options menu. So a method that runs automatically called onCreate options menu. So if you go ahead and autocomplete that to override this method, you can see there we have the onCreate options menu. It's an override because this happens automatically when an activity is created, but we're now going to intercept this code, do some of our own code, and this will create the options menu. So by default, we're not overriding anything here. It's a method that has a menu parameter. It overrides this method. So a method section entirely on the Android activity. What I mean by that is it's part of the code that runs whenever an activity is created. And we're going to be covering very soon in a mini section entirely on the Android activity lifecycle, what this concept of lifecycle really means in detail. But for now, all we need to know is there's a method called, if you can make a few line breaks after onCreate and start typing, on C create O options menu. So a method that runs automatically called onCreate options menu. So if you go ahead and autocomplete that to override this method, you can see there we have the onCreate options menu. It's an override because this happens automatically when an activity is created, but we're now going to intercept this code, do some of our own code, and this will create the options menu. So by default, we're not overriding anything here. It's a method that has a menu parameter, so this will be the space for us to put our menu into. It's given to us by the system, we don't have to worry too much about that. This is not our menu resource, it's the actual UI, user interface menu, that we put our menu resource into. So we get given this, and then it returns a boolean, true or false. And basically, if we return true, the menu will show, and if we return false, the menu won't show. So it's a relatively simple system method. So we can go ahead now and delete this return to onCreate options menu, and do what we need to do to make our menu show. So just like we inflate a layout file, in the onCreate method for putting the view on the screen, we take some XML, we inflate that, we create our user interface from that, we inflate it. It's a similar thing for the options menu. But rather than a layout inflator, it is a menu inflator. So if you start typing the word menu lowercase, and you can see we have access to this menu inflator. Again, this comes to us for free as being part of app compat activity. So if you autocomplete menu inflator, and then there's a method called .inflate. If you look at the prompt there, it takes two arguments. A menu resource, well, we've already made that, so an r.menu resource. And then the menu, the actual toolbar space where the menu items can go into, it takes that as the second argument. So this is nice and straightforward. We do r.menu for our menu resource, and it is toolbar. So that's the XML, which it will read to create menu items from. And then we just type the word menu, the menu that's been given to us by this method. And that line there is complete. And what that will do is it will read our XML, create UI elements, those text options that you saw in the messaging app. It will create them inside this menu space that is available by default in activities. And all we need to do to make sure it will show is to return true. Simple as that. And with that one method and this one menu resource file, if we now run the app, you can see we have three dots in the top right, our options menu, and when I click it, our three options are there. Fantastic. We've gone pretty much as far as we can go now before actually needing to save the data and store